A global economy such as the one the world has been experiencing in the 21st century has many advantages, including lower costs, greater availability of goods, and access to a skilled workforce that may not be available locally. Disruptions to that economy and the supply chain of goods can be triggered by bad weather, trade disputes, or a global pandemic, and they create a waterfall effect with broad consequences. Supply chain issues have been in the news lately a lot, mostly for shortages and disruptions that they've caused to gasoline supply, holiday gifts and food, and the availability of the latest iPhone or car models. But beyond chip or driver shortages, disruptions to a trusted supply chain can create cybersecurity risks, as trusted technology suppliers may be replaced by new suppliers due to shortages. Managing that supply chain means managing risk about cyber safety for both industry providers and government purchasers. Today's event is designed to provide information about standards already in place, the resources available to help with supply chain information and management, and a look at what's ahead. We have two key people today joining us for this conversation. Joanne Wojtek, NASA SEWP Program Manager. Joanne has grown a program that was originally designed to help NASA purchase scientific workstations into a best-in-class GWAT that's one of the largest vehicles in government for acquiring IT products and services. And Renee Wynn is a former NASA CIO and ACT chair who spent decades in government in technology roles trying to find better ways to acquire solutions and solve problems. But let's start with Joanne, and I'll talk about this event and the issues that we hope to address today. Joanne?
Thank you, Ann, and thank you, Marvin, for your initial remarks. He did have it pretty much right about SEWP and where we're from. And as Ann also mentioned, we started off very humbly trying to help a scientist get his computer back in '93. And that's a supply chain issue. How do you get a computer? Supply chain, dominates the world in ways that we maybe didn't pay attention to. One of the things that I learned as I went through my journey, particularly with Open Group, you want to give them a big kudos for helping me learn a lot about how industry views supply chain, and also going to talks from NIST and other places. Supply chain, we're so immersed in the IT part of it in supply chain risk management. But water is a supply chain issue. Oil, we just saw recently, is a supply chain issue. Supply chain it can involve how well your computer works in terms of security and whether there's any malignancies there, or it can be an issue of, is it tainted water? It's probably even worse than tainted computers. So such a broad spectrum. SEWP is not a policy maker. We're not even a standards maker. We were part of that standards group, but it was the group itself that made it. But we are an information hub. That's part of our goal as a program to provide our customers, both industry and government, with the best information we can gather about the key issues today. And obviously, supply chain is one of the biggest ones out there. Has been for a while, has certainly, as noted, become more in the news, but it's always been a part of the infrastructure issues. So we've been looking for ways to improve how we get that information out, and decided to start using these forums. As mentioned, we hope to have another one in the spring, hopefully in person, possibly even multi-day, where we can really get into the depths of what supply chain means. And one of the keys to that SEWP has always brought with it to its information is it has to be practical. It has to be based on the realities of how industry operates and how government operates. And sometimes we get too stuck in impracticalities or being too much government, trying to say you have to do it this way, and industry saying you can't do it this way. And neither of the two can meet. And we want to find ways to make the two meet. And hopefully forums like this will increase that conversation.
Thank you. Renee, as a practitioner, you have a lot of experience in seeing how the supply chain challenges actually work. I want to talk a little bit about how in the real NASA world, the supply chain issues affect how you did your job.
Good morning, Anne. Good morning, Joanne. It's great to be on the panel with you too, and see you both again, even if I can't give you big giant hugs after our long hiatus here. Yeah, so from a practitioner's perspective, and I want to back up too, and I applaud NASA for the work that they did to bring together an IT procurement division. I was aware that that was going to happen because I happened to have been at NASA when that was being considered. And I think in this day and age, in particular, because of the risks posed through supply chain to the United States government and to national security, and this is to local, state, and tribal governments as well, I think it's a great way to do it. And bringing in SEWP and Joanne and all that she's built was a really good move to try to start to wrestle with this very, very challenging and large greased pig. And so from my perspective, I got the opportunity to face cybersecurity risks through supply chain straight head on in support of one of NASA's missions. And before I start on that story, I do want to add, from a supply chain perspective, I broke it down into kind of 3 buckets. And in my simple pea brain, it helps to break things down so that when you focus on something, you know which bucket you're focusing on, even if there are some interdependencies between those buckets. And that's cybersecurity risks, the parts integrity associated with what you're purchasing, and the accessibility of what you're purchasing. We talked about, Joanne mentioned water and gasoline. We had accessibility issues with both of those, and the gasoline one was posed. That accessibility issue was done through ransomware and cybersecurity threat. So I had this great experience at NASA, and we had established a supply chain risk process. And hats off to Mike Witt, the CISO there, and Kenitra Tyler for putting NASA's cybersecurity supply chain risk on the map. We've got many an audit. You can go Google that. NASA's got a lot of audits on supply chain risk. We wore it well, and just grateful for their ingenuity and their perseverance to establish a process, and working with Joanne and others in the procurement office. And so what came across my desk one day was a chip, and the chip didn't come across my desk. The desire to purchase that chip came across my desk. I probably would have lost the chip had it come across my desk. And it was, we really need this chip. We are using the same chip in a mission, and that chip was questionable from a cybersecurity supply chain risk aspect. And so I agreed that we would meet and hear the story, because all of this is about risk. And so we sat down, and Mike and others joined me, and we listened to the program manager for the mission, and basically said, I got to match the chips in this mission. The mission's got to fly by this date. Launch dates can be very narrow, the windows of opportunity for what you want to do with your satellite. And so we sat down, and they explained to us what they were doing with the chip. And with that understanding, we were able to, with Mike's and Kenitra and everybody's input, make a risk-based decision for NASA to proceed with purchasing and continuing to use this chip, even though we knew it posed higher risks than we had been unwilling previously to accept. The good news is the way NASA was going to use this chip, it actually brought the risk situation downward. And so it was an easy decision to sign off and agree to accept the risk associated with the use of this chip. And that use case becomes pretty critical when you look at where computers are made, where chips are made, where hardware is made, where software coding is done. It's done all across the globe. And you've really got to look at that use case. It makes it hard to move fast, but there's lots of different ways you can change your process and move fast.
Well, thank you. That's a good example. So Joanne, back to you. how have you all been assessing the risk for, how do you decide what to, which versions to offer? And I know you work with industry on that, but how do you let the customers know what kind of risk is involved in any particular, because obviously they're not going to be checking the chips like Renee did.
Neither are we. So it is an interesting part of the problem of supply chain. How in depth and how much time and effort does, as Renee pointed out, just that one chip, how much do you put into each element of what you're doing? You could spend you could spend hundreds, millions, billions of dollars, checking out each little piece of equipment. So you do have to do some assessment, and that's why there are things like standards that you might help with, and NIST recommendations to follow, or your own CIO. But with SEWP being one of the contracts that is used by every government agency, we also have the problem that we can't make a decision for agencies on our own. I can use the information given to me by NASA to do. I have the program set up a catalog of approved items for NASA. We also have one similar one going on with Interior, and we're working with other agencies to do their own assessments that we can then offer to their agency users. These are the items that your CIO, your office has made a decision on. The other thing that we can do is ensure that we are giving the best information we can about the supply chain process. How has the items come from the manufacturer to the customer? Particularly because SEWP is primarily a reseller/integrator contract. You have a few companies that also manufacture, but it's primarily integration and resellers providing these products. So we have very robust, and we do believe it's the best in the country, if not the world, in terms of how we verify. We have a very direct connection to every company that is making products, making sure that the companies selling them are known and that they're approved. And if they're not, we tell the customer. The customer doesn't care where they get the products. That's their decision. But we want to make sure that they are aware, and we make it very clear to them. They can't say they didn't notice it anymore, because we've improved that piece of it. So we have that layer. We have the ISO standard. I think we're somewhere around 60 of our 140 companies now are certified with the ISO standard. That is clearly shown on our website, and the customer can ask for that information as part of their RFQ. So again, we're an information hub. We're not a decider, but we do provide the information the customer can use to make the supply chain. And the other piece of it that we do that also I don't believe anybody else does is when a company is added as a manufacturer on our list, we go find out who really owns that company, which often gets us in, the companies complain. They'll go, well, our name is Acme USA. We're in the USA. Yes, but you're owned by a company in China. I need to make sure that our customers know who owns that company. And so we do spend time making sure that we know who's the owner and identify that for our customers, so they can, if they need to make that decision, that's part of their risk management decision, they can do so.
Okay. And Renee, we had a question from the audience who specifically, what was the issue with the chip? Why was it a problem? And I think they would like a little deeper dive into what kinds of issues you had there.
Sure. And actually, Joanne, I think sort of started off that conversation and answering this question, I think, really well. So when you look at the cybersecurity risks associated with a chip, in this instance, you need to look at where it was made. There are actually only a handful of chip makers. And obviously, we all have learned this since buying cars. Anything that requires a chip is a real challenge right now. You have to look at who's coding, who is touching that chip along the way. So a lot of this particular chip was made in a country that gave us pause, and the chip had been documented as having shown some challenges associated with what might be embedded in that chip. And so that chip was recommended not to really be used by the United States government. And again, I'm choosing my words carefully because we made a risk-based decision, and the information Joanne's team gives to agency is you got to look at the use case and you got to look at the risk tolerance for the project the thing is going into. However, she's right. You can't do it for everything. If you have 500,000 pieces of IT in your ecosystem, you're not doing this individual look. So this particular chip was considered a red, I'll call it, I'll use a red, green, yellow stoplight chart. And this chip showed up red in the look at the risk that this posed to the United States government. And so what we did is we found out what the team was going to do. And effectively the team was going to, my language, was burn out the chip and then rebuild the chip up in order to use it in the flight hardware. So in that instance, if there was anything nefarious on that chip, we had a high chance that the chip, that probably wasn't going to survive the process at NASA. And the other part was because it was going to be in an ecosystem that was going to be highly monitored, then, again, if you saw some anomalous behaviors in the flight hardware, you would know it and you would be able to, take mitigation steps associated with what you were seeing. So, and building on what Joanne said, so with this chip, it was in the red, and the way we're going to use it, we brought it down to sort of a yellow-green in terms of the use case because of the way we were going to use the chip, the things that NASA was going to do on top of that chip, and the monitoring associated with where that chip was going to be used. This sort of gets to, this is why network monitoring is so key, is it's a pretty large ecosystem, especially in the United States government. You got to monitor what's happening. So if you've got some anomalous behaviors, you can move rather quickly in order to mitigate that or watch what's happening. So in this particular instance, that's what the chip was. And we felt pretty good about the risk-based decision that we made.
Well, we have a follow-up question. I love the fact that we have engaged audience. And what would happen if the risk were too high? What do you do? I think in this case, you didn't have a lot of other choices, but what happens if you decide it's too high a risk?
So, thank you for this question. I really do appreciate it because it allows me to talk about a little bit of the whole cyber posture and legacy software and hardware that exists within organizations. You can't, so at NASA, right, we had flying assets that were legacy IT, and I call that good legacy IT. They're bringing back data about the universe and our planet, and that's a great thing to be able to study that. So, to that question of what is too much of a tolerance, and problem solvers are all over the globe. And I happen to have worked at NASA, which is filled with problem solvers and imagining things that are, science fiction, and then they turn it into fact. So I don't think there was ever a problem we couldn't solve. But let's say this is on a red. Well, then we could have continued to work with the team to mitigate the risks that we understood by making visible the supply chain. And that's, Joanne makes visible with the ISO standards. There are companies that acquire data, intel data, intelligence data, put that together in a way that allows businesses to be able to make decisions faster on whether they should use something. So we probably would have stuck with it because it really was a binary problem. The hardware had to have this chip because of the rest of the design of the flight hardware. So we would have just stayed at the whiteboard, so to speak, and found different ways to mitigate the risk, which is what we did for all of our flying assets that were launched way back before cybersecurity in space was a serious threat. And we just went over and found different ways to mitigate the risk and accept some of the risk because there's really nothing you can do. So you just put on your problem solver hat, be focused on yes, and what are we going to do? And you'll find a way through every path. It does create time So you can only do this in special cases because you're pulling in a lot of great talent to get to yes.
So that really is key to understanding one of the biggest confusions I see with customers out there is they forget that there are four important words: supply chain and risk management. And it's not supply chain certainty. There's no such statement out there that can exist. And I have actually gotten that question from customers: how do we ensure that everything is 100% perfect as it goes through the supply chain? And there's no assurance, but you do have places where you manage your risks and you decide where that is. I want to tell a really quick story. I don't think I've told this very often. I was at a shipbuilding facility up in New England, and one of the Navy personnel there pointed out that when they build a ship, they have to account for everything, including the bolts on the submarines, as to that they did not come from a foreign country. And that is a detail that we probably don't care about for most of our constructions. But when you're building a submarine, your risk goes up, and you have to manage it much differently than you do if you're just building an office building. So I keep that in mind when I hear people talk about it as if it's a simple statement on off. It depends on so many factors, including where you're going from. And the other one I'll say is I remember at NASA being in a authority to operate meeting, and somebody was explaining why they were running like Windows NT, because it was on a satellite that had Windows NT and they couldn't bring the satellite back. So you have to manage where you're at.
Yeah. Joanne, I want to build on your points, and that is then also parts change, right? So let's, the bolt, like I get it from X. Well, that company gets bought out or that company goes out of business, and then you switch over to another one. So the other part of this process, or the other part of supply chain risk, is building a process that can both be scalable as well as acknowledge when you have changes in the thing you're accustomed to buying lots of. And laptops, NASA buys a lot of laptops or leases a lot of laptops. And so you get your typical laptop with the logo on it, and the logo may stay the same, but where it came from, who manufactured it, in October may be very different by the time you get to December. And so your process needs to have the check that flows with things coming in and out of your organization, and then figuring out if you can reduce the friction in the process where the risks are the lowest in terms of usage.
I know we've gotten some more questions from the audience. They are going to keep us on our toes here, asking how the ISO standard affects the process. And I know we also have a NIST framework. So I don't know which one of you wants to jump in and explain.
Yeah, so the ISO standard 20243, the way I explain it, because people think mostly when they hear ISO, in our world at least, they think of ISO 9000, which is a business process standard. The ISO 20243 is a supply chain process standard. If a company meets that standard, it's what it was built up as is taking the best knowledge of what industry can do to reduce the risk of tainting and counterfeiting in the supply chain. And so, if the company follows all the pieces of that standard and gets certified as such, they have done all they can, in that regard, as seen by industry standards, to reduce that risk. It is just a piece of the puzzle. It's not meant to, again, say, yes, if your ISO standard, everything 100%, it's one more mitigation against, especially counterfeiting and tainting. And there's much more. I don't want to spend the whole time going into the details of that. We can always go to our website. There's information there, or contact SEWP for us to send you to the open group who has that standard. The NIST framework. One of the interesting parts is that the NIST framework is primarily geared to high level security systems. It's not actually geared towards medium level. Another misunderstanding. People are like, well, it says this in the standard. It's not a standard. It's a framework, and it's not meant for every system. But it does give you guidelines. gives you guidelines about all across the board of how you can mitigate your risks. What we did at SEWP is we said, well, we have two different sorts of we have a framework, we have an ISO standard, and we have a white paper that says here's where those two intersect. And so if you're doing the ISO standard, you've also met some of this framework and vice versa. So that was the purpose of the two. Each one helps, but none of them has a yes/no answer. They all are about how to manage that risk.
Okay. Do you see the NIST playbook as helping guide the acquisition of professionals at agencies? It just provides them a roadmap or questions to ask?
Yes, I think it's one of the pieces to be aware of. It's lengthy and it changes and it updates. Again, this is where people want to have that final answer. A simple one: gray market. Even in that standard for high level systems, it does not say do not ever do gray market. It says quite plainly, if you buy gray market, which is not authorized but not black market, not totally unknown, that is risky. It's very risky. Be very careful. And so explains how to do that. So it still requires work. To Renee's statement earlier, you can spend a lot of time on each one of these and digging into it. So you have to look at where that framework gives you the work for. If you're going to buy a cable on a home system that's never connected to a high security system, maybe the cable doesn't matter where you buy it from. If you're buying it for a submarine, they're probably going to care. So it gives you that idea of what are the check marks you want to make. And I assume, and Renee can probably better say this, I'm assuming that the CIO's office in some ways uses that when they make the decisions about what to be approved for purchasing. And that's a good usage of a CIO and the centralization of IT, not making all the decisions, but providing that that these things are known to meet certain risk criteria.
Yeah. I want to add to that that these frameworks are guidelines, not guardrails. And the other part is it's the foundation, and then you have to hand it off to the practitioners and the decision makers to really sort of examine how you need to approach the use of a component. And I'll use examples. So the mobile launch unit at the Kennedy Space Center at NASA has 400,000 sensors on it. And that's a lot because you've got your umbilical cord release, you've got your fueling, you've got your temperature sensors, you've got all these other sensors on it doing lots of different things. In this case, when you replace a few dozen, there needs to be this ecosystem you're matching. And sensors are coming in smarter than they did even 10 years ago. Smarter meaning, you don't just put them on and they do one thing. They can actually connect up and create this ecosystem within the sensors. We're not going to say, no, you can't have the sensors you need for mobile launch system. What you're going to do is make sure that the system is monitored so that if something looks anomalous, and rest assured, the mobile system, the mobile launch unit is in fact monitored, because if something should happen, it's going to be a big deal on Launchpad and it'll make the news. It'll be maybe not the news you want to make on it. So you get into the monitoring approach associated with something, and there's sort of these layers built into, from my perspective, I always think in terms of cybersecurity, you build in these layers, your defense in depth. So Joanne builds her work in the acquisition process on the framework. You hand it off to a practitioner's view. We're using same framework, and then we add another framework on it, on the cybersecurity side, and they match because they come from NIST. And then you look at what are the ways you can mitigate that risk. And the first one is monitor it. Know your part, monitor your part. And so anything in your system, what's happening. Those are the really the big things that you need to pay attention to.
So I know we're coming up on time, but I wanted to bring up trust, because I know that that's one of the things that NASA SEWP helps to provide is trust in the manufacturers. Joanne, can you talk a little bit about trust and how you help provide that information to the customers?
Well, hopefully we ourselves are trustworthy. You have to start with that, and then we work very closely. I think the most important thing for trust is to work closely with the companies and the customers, and that has always been a cornerstone of SEWP from '93 on. We've always made sure that we really know the companies. We meet with them constantly. We are monitoring them constantly. We're reporting on them constantly. And congratulating them constantly and showing the good things they do. So there needs to be, I think communication would be my key takeaway with this short amount of time left, to say, if you're going to build trust, start with communication, and SEWP really builds a lot of that into our systems. And that helps that trustiness, that it's not just going out into some place that you don't know what's happening.
My one add, and I know we want to add, is then that trust also has to extend into the contractors that an organization uses. Are they looking at supply chain risk? Are they building a trustworthy relationship with whomever they serve, whether it's the scientific community, as I got to know the IT community, the government contractors? Joanne is absolutely right, is about the trust and its relationships. And then what are your processes that I then can understand and know what you might be passing along to that. So it's building off of what Joanne's team does with SEWP, building into how you use your parts and how you interact with your contractors. I commonly say, as a contractor of the United States government, don't be the reason the CIO gets to go testify in front of Congress.
Well, I think on that note, I will hand. That's a good lesson. There were some questions we didn't get to, but perhaps we'll be able to get to them a little bit later. So I think I'll hand it back to Troy.
Can I just make a quick for that, Troy? Can somebody make sure that I get those questions either somehow sent to me at the end of the day? I can go over them. Yes,
we will absolutely make a list.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.